Good morning. The Lord be with you. Thank you. You are such a beautiful congregation. You get younger all the time because new people come. And even those of us who are wizened and older, I think, get more and more beautiful in our maturity. I want to offer my thanks to Pastor Steve and Pastor Devin and Pastor John for inviting me to be here with you today to celebrate this 30th anniversary, 30 years of an amazing church. Starting as an idea in the mind of Dr. Robert Puckett, or Phuket, as some of us like to call him. Did you ever imagine the dream would turn out to be like this? As I prepared to come into worship with the pastors, I was again struck first and foremost by the beauty of the church. It is so clean and lovely. I knew Jim Fella had to be at work somewhere around here making the church just right for this day. And then the music, Harriet playing pre-service music, and Harriet and Fred then with that great version of Victory in Jesus, my mother's favorite song. And the choir, one of the most amazing choirs I've ever known, and you are better and better and better all the time, not only in terms of quality, but in terms of the faith you express through your music. You minister to all of us as you sing. This is a special day, not only in the life of our church, but certainly for me as well. It is the first time I've been in this pulpit since I retired in 2014. And that day, I told you about a memory I had about the very first Sunday I preached here. It was over in the Founders Chapel, and I stepped into the pulpit, as all new ministers do, and looked out over a congregation, and it was a sea of anonymous faces. I had not yet been able to connect names and faces or stories with people. It was a great sea of anonymity. And then time passed, 18 years in my case. And I stood in the pulpit on the last Sunday as your senior pastor, and no longer were you a sea of anonymous faces, but you were a deep and rich ocean of beloved friends and sacred stories, of which my story and Sandy's story had become a part. And I've been sitting up here today looking out at you and thinking that I see much the same thing, those beloved friends, but in some cases our beloved friends have found a need to be elsewhere. Some have gone home to God. Some have moved closer to family. Some, no doubt, have gone up the hill to Charlie's church. And I see many of their faces. I see Bob, Linda Wright. I see Don Mills out there with Peggy. I see Diane with Nate, and Annie Autry with Jim. My wife Sandy used to sit right over there. She sat in between Ken Ray and Shannon Meadows. She thought her mission was to keep them under control, which was not only a thankless job, but a futile endeavor. And I see they have now moved Ken over to that side of the church. And as I looked out today, I've seen lots of faces I don't recognize. You're new, and I welcome you to this great church. look forward to meeting many of you today. And I hope that you'll take very, very seriously the incredible legacy and important ministry that this church is. Come and be part of it. Give yourself fully to it and watch what God can do. A few weeks ago, a friend of mine asked what text I was going to use for preaching at the 30th anniversary service here, and I said Genesis 2. And he, being something of a biblical scholar, said, Genesis 2, isn't that about Adam and Eve? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, what does a couple of people running around naked in a garden have to do with a 30th anniversary celebration? And I said, well, welcome to Tellico Village. And he said, no, really, why are you preaching on that text? What does it have to do with an anniversary? And I said, it has more to do with it than you may realize. We all remember the opening chapters of Genesis. Genesis 1 begins with that marvelous hymn of creation. And you know, when you're reading and studying the Bible, you know that you're reading a hymn or a song when you have a series of verses separated by a repeated refrain. And in Genesis 1, the refrain is, it is good. So God says, let there be light, and there is light, and God forms the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule over the night. And then God and all the angels step back to see what God has done, and they sing, it is good. And then God causes the dry land to appear and creates animals and all sorts of creepy, crawling creatures. And God and all the company of heaven step back and say, it is good. And the song goes on through the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. It is good. And let us create man in our own image, after God's own image. God created them male and female, and all creation sang, it is good. Do you hear the song? It is good, it is good, it is good, it is good. But then in chapter 2, the tune changes. Have you ever noticed that? Verse 18, it is not good. You see, God has created Adam, formed him out of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam becomes a living soul. And God takes Adam and places him in a beautiful garden. Now, you know, the word Adam really is mankind, but for us to get our feeble human minds around it, we reduce that to the one man, Adam. Adam is in the man cave of all man caves, or the Adam cave, as they may have called it back then. He has got the biggest TV Best Buy can provide. He's got all the sports channels. He has got a remote control that no one else has the right to run. He's got a refrigerator full of beer and a closet full of potato chips. Adam has it made in the shade, but there is a problem. Adam is lonely. Have you ever been lonely? Do you know what it's like to be alone? I'm learning all over again what it means. When I came to Tellico in 1996, our founding pastor, Carl Burke, took me out to lunch one day. And what a great experience to spend any time at all with Carl, because he was just such a deep and rich and bright soul. You know, Carl had served as a medic in World War II, was taken prisoner by the Germans. His parents, his family didn't know if he was dead or alive. He survived the war, came home, got married, had a couple of beautiful children, but then his wife died. And sometime later, he met another beautiful woman by the name of Caroline. And they were married. And they hung around together for how many years, Caroline? 55 years. Carl was not only a wonderful father and husband and pastor and preacher, but he was full of wit. He loved to say when someone else came in to preach in the pulpit, "That guy preached the most wonderful sermon I've ever heard, and there were many places to end it." And he missed them all. And Carl's most favorite line, and mine as well nowadays, "The most beautiful color in the world is the red of the taillights taking your grandchildren home." So Carl and I were at lunch. And he said, "Marty, there's something that you need to know about the church in the village. You need to know something about the people." He said, "Many of the people here are lonely. They've come from someplace else. They've left homes, families, children, grandchildren, careers and vocations, support networks. And they've come to this new place," and he said, "some of them wonder if they've made the right decision and they feel all alone. And others of them come and find a diagnosis of cancer and they're all alone. And some of them lose their spouses and the retirement dream is smashed to smithereens and they are all alone." Adam was alone. And God said, "It is not good." So God does the most amazing thing that's ever been done in the history of the world. It's not something that theologians talk about. He forms or causes a deep sleep to fall on Adam and reaches into his side and pulls out a rib and creates another human being. She will be called Eve, and Eve means womankind. But we think of her as an individual because we are puny human beings who can't think big thoughts like God thinks. And as Adam awakens from sleep, he sees this other creature, and he says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." And Adam isn't alone anymore. And then Genesis 2 ends with these words, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And I'm so very sorry that theologians today want to take that passage and try to turn it into some legalistic definition of biblical marriage, which it is not at all about. I mean, after all, Adam didn't have a mother and father to leave, did he? This is a story not about the beginnings of marriage. This is a story about God's creation of human love. And for this reason, Bob and Jane met and had a great life together. And for this reason, you had children, and when they were born, wrapped them up in your arms and loved them so deeply you knew that you would give your life for them. And for this reason, when your neighbor is hurting, you go down the street to the house and you try to help out. Because love is the power that mends loneliness. 2 years after our church was started, one of our church members by the name of James Winston Martin was out participating in one of his favorite events. He was a bicycle rider, cyclist. And he suffered an accident, and unfortunately, that accident caused him to have a catastrophic spinal cord injury. When he was rushed to the hospital, the doctor saved his life. They later transferred him to Patricia Neal Rehabilitation Center up in Knoxville to try somehow to help him now as a quadriplegic to be ready to come home and live in his own house. His wife, Beth, had the whole burden of caring for Win, trying to take care of a house here in the village and yet be up 35, 40 miles in Knoxville to help her husband during the course of every day. And that's when these people right here, and others like them, did such an amazing thing. They organized themselves together, and every morning someone made the drive up to Knoxville to feed Win Martin breakfast. And someone went at noontime to feed him lunch. And someone went at supper time to feed him dinner. And others, like Bob Provard and folks, trimmed rose bushes down at the house and mowed the lawn. And they kept this up for 8 months. Because you see, it's not good for people who suffer injuries like this to be alone. And so God gives the gift of love to bring mending and healing and wholeness to the loneliness. It's such an important part of the story of our faith. There was a day, years after that I was attending a clergy association meeting in Lenore City when our church member Ed Conti, and I think Terry Boyes, was Terry Boyes a part of that? Terry Boyes came in and they told us about a dream that they and others were having. They had been finding out about the horrible incidences of child abuse taking place in our county and the other counties around the 9th Judicial District. And they were working on this dream of creating something called a Child Advocacy Center. And they told us about the dream and wondered if maybe the churches could do something about it. So I drove back to the church, and I think we had a council meeting that week, and I believe Lee Reinmiller was on the council. And as soon as I told them about what had been shared with us, Lee and the others said, well, we have got to do something about this. And so volunteers were called for, and many people from our church. How many of you have ever volunteered at the CAC? Look at you. Millie Bruner has worked down there and poured her heart out. An amazing, amazing thing for the little children of Loudoun County. And then one day, it was January of the year, and Dick Davies, Barbara's husband, called me, summoned me really, over to their house. Now, if you never met Dick, you need to know Dick was a member of the 1964 United States Olympic basketball team that beat the Russians. And he was immensely proud of that. Called me over to his house that day and he said, Marty, we got to do something more for the Child Advocacy Center. And I said, okay, well, what do you want to do? He said, I don't know, that's why I called you over here. And so we sat and we talked about it for a little while, and the idea emerged that, February is Love Month. Why don't we have a Valentine's program? And we'll invite people of the church to buy a Valentine. $25 will get a Valentine for a little abused child and a boy, and $25 will get a little girl, and $50 would get a boy and a girl. And as I was driving home, I was thinking, how in the world can we sell this to the congregation? And it is when God gave me a vision. You know how in Revelation, John has these visions of the sea, beast coming out of the sea and all its detail? Well, this was vivid and it had detail, and it was of Bob Puckett dressed up like Cupid. So I knew it was from God. And ever since, Bob Puckett has been standing up here, I guess dressed still as Cupid, I'm not sure, and asking you to share in this important project. And just the other day, I was just so proud and so blessed to read that last year alone, 352 abused children were helped through the Child Advocacy Center. Because it is not good for children to go through the hell of abuse alone. And only love can mend a lonely heart. And I could go on. I could talk about the Good Samaritan Center and the Good Neighbor Shop and all that. Smoky Mountain Service dogs. One of the best things about those presentations, and what I always loved, was coming to the presentation when a dog was given to a wounded warrior, and I would watch Mike Kitchens cry. And he'd just bawl like a baby because his heart's full of love, and it is not good for people who are wounded to go through life alone. Do you hear what I'm saying? And it's not just about doing for others. It's about being the church we are. Our church started not as one of the many denominational churches around, although we are full of many denominations. But Bob Puckett's dream was for all of us from all of our different denominational backgrounds to come together and set those things in second place, but put at the center the person of Jesus Christ our Lord, our common faith in Christ. And that meant that anybody could come here and feel welcome, because there are many people who are religiously lonely. There are people who have doubts. There are people who've been hurt by the church. There are people who just can't deal with the church anymore. And yet this is a church that is open to everyone to come and work out their lives. And that's why Milt Goldfein came here. Jewish boy who grew up, I think, in Brooklyn, New York. Wasn't it Brooklyn? Jewish boy from Brooklyn, New York meets a beautiful woman, Baptist, from Maggie Valley, Tennessee. And they get married and have a life together, and the thing about Milt is that Milt is a rocket scientist. And they have a career that eventually brings them out to Pasadena, California, and the Jet Propulsion Lab, where Milt is the manager for the testing and launch facilities for many different NASA missions, including the Mariner project, and most importantly, the Galileo project that sent the spacecraft to Jupiter. And they retired and came back here to Tellico Village. So where does a Jewish boy from New York go to church in Tellico Village? I want to ask you. Well, they came here because Carl Burke became his friend and Bob Puckett became his friend. And they would have these big ethereal conversations about all sorts of wonderful things. And when Milt came to the end of his life, he wanted the pastors of the community church to lead his service. Because no one should have to walk through their faith journey with all its struggles by themselves. So, now it's up to you. 30 years have brought us to this moment. And the reason I want to bring you this message is because here is what has happened over all the years, and here is what will happen in the future. People will come along and try to convince you that that is not enough. They will try to convince you that love is not enough. It's more important about what your particular view is on the Bible or some passage in the Bible. They're going to try to convince you that it is more important for you to be doing some religious thing than doing some act of compassion out in the community. And friends, I'm going to ask you, resist that temptation. Because Jesus said in Matthew 25 that it really is not what you believe that counts, it is how you love others. And how you love others is the true reflection of what you actually believe. So commit yourself to this life of love and let this church continue to be a church that love has built and that love is building. Shortly after Sandy and I moved to Lexington, Kentucky, we came across a church, Presbyterian church. And across the front of the church was a big banner, and in huge letters, the banner said, "Sacramental Presbyterians, who would have imagined?" Well, Sandy and I looked at each other and thought, not us for sure. We didn't even know what that was. And we drove along and started talking about the things people say about their churches and the signs they put out front and how they advertise and all this kind of stuff. And Sandy, from her seat over there between Ken and Shannon, said something like this. She said, "Honey, can you imagine how different it would be if instead of saying Sacramental Presbyterians, who could imagine, that sign out there said something like, this is a church where love lives, and you are welcome here." So what kind of church do you want to be as the next 30 years unfolds?